Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of Mark. Today we're going to open up with chapter 7, and we're going to be reading 7 and 8 on the day. And so chapter 7 opens up with Jesus talking to the Pharisees about what defiles a man. So the Pharisees are linking sin and dirt, and for them, washing is a mark of holiness. Now, they criticize Jesus' disciples for not washing their hands before eating food. And then Jesus quotes the prophet Isaiah, who says that human rules can hide a hostile heart. And that is actually in Isaiah chapter 29, verse 13. Jesus shows how the Pharisees have taken one of God's clearest commandments and confused it by adding extra conditions. God has said, honor your father and mother, but the Pharisees have devised a rule of Corban, which means devoted to God. Under this rule, any money that is already set aside for God can't possibly be used to support elderly parents. Jesus teaches that nothing we eat can make us sinful. Sin is in our hearts already. Food goes into our stomachs, not into our hearts or wills. Immorality, pride, and greed are not caused by food. They spring from the evil that is already present in human nature. So what's happening here is we have the Pharisees that have set out these rules, and they're more concerned with following the letters of these rules than they are with taking care of actual people. And that's why I bring up that and what Mark brought up there about the Pharisees and talking about honoring the father and the mother, because the Pharisees have said it's more important that you give to the church than that you take care of your parents, your elderly parents, which is not what God says. That they're basically putting their own spin on how God has told them to live. And so the Pharisees are just so focused on these letters of the law, and they're ignoring the things that are actually sin, the things that are actually corrupting people. And that is what Jesus is teaching them, that nothing that you eat will make you sinful. Sin is in our hearts. And so after that, we meet a woman, a Syrophoenician woman, and so that's starting in chapter 24. And so Jesus leaves Israel and goes towards Tyre, which is a cosmopolitan type area on the Mediterranean coast. He needs a break. However, a Gentile woman seeks him out and begs him to drive a demon out of her daughter. Jesus resists the woman's request at first. His task is to feed the children of Israel, he says, and he must not get sidetracked to tossing little crumbs to dogs, which he's talking about the Gentiles. And so Jesus here, is he really calling the Gentiles dogs? I don't think so. I think what Jesus is really doing is he's just saying, my job is to take care of my children. My job is to take care of Israel. I can't just take care of everybody. But what he was doing is he was testing this woman. He was testing her to see how much faith does she really have, and does she really believe that he can do it? So the woman accepts what Jesus is saying, but still tries to persuade him. Of course, Israel must be fed, but isn't it quite natural for Gentiles to benefit too, even if they are no better than dogs under the table? And Jesus can't possibly refuse her request. She returns home to find that her daughter has been freed from the evil spirit. And then after that encounter, starting in verse 31, Jesus heals a man who is both deaf and dumb. Jesus travels north some 20 miles before heading south and coming again to the area of the 10 towns. He's in Gentile territory when he heals a man who is deaf and tongue-tied. Like many healers of his day, Jesus uses his fingers and his saliva. Jesus sighs deeply as he channels the power of God to this needy person. And so Jesus, he actually uses a word there, ephatha, which means be open. So this is not a magic spell, but it's actually a divine command from Jesus. So Mark describes Jesus healing deafness. The prophet Isaiah foretold that one day the eyes of the blind will be open and the ears of the deaf unstopped. And that's in Isaiah chapter 35, verse 5. These are physical cures with spiritual meanings. One day people will no longer be spiritually blind and deaf. The lines of communication with God will be open. And so Jesus here, he's healing people physically, and he's fulfilling prophecies physically, and he's also coming with these spiritual meanings as well, where there are many people in our world today that are blind and deaf spiritually. They can see fine physically, they can hear fine physically, but they don't know the Lord. They don't know Jesus. And and they are blind and deaf spiritually. And Jesus, one day, that will be healed. And Jesus comes and he does offer that. And then that brings us to chapter 8, where Jesus is going to feed a crowd of 4,000. So this is the second time that we've seen Jesus feeding a large crowd in Mark's gospel. This time there are some 4,000 people who have been with Jesus for 3 days in the wilderness. They are hungry and Jesus feeds them all from 7 loaves and a few small fish. Jesus gives thanks and he breaks the bread just as he did before. The disciples assist with the distribution of the food and everyone has plenty. There are 7 large baskets of scraps left over. Nobody really knows why Mark has included 2 similar stories. Some think that the numbers are important, but there's no agreement on what they might mean. One idea is that Jesus is feeding Gentiles to match his earlier feeding of the Jews, but Mark doesn't say that himself. So the Pharisees want Jesus to prove his identity by performing another miracle, but Jesus refuses. He never responds to demands for signs from heaven. Instead, he looks for faith, and faith never asks for proof. Jesus is exasperated by their willful unbelief. And so meanwhile, the disciples haven't brought enough bread. Why carry loaves when they have the amazing Jesus with them? Jesus warns them against demanding signs. It's a form of unbelief, and unbelief spreads and spoils, like yeast in flour. Jesus had created bread to show that he was the Son of God, not so that they didn't need to buy bread anymore. Both the Pharisees and the disciples are slow to understand the meaning of Jesus' miracles. So the Pharisees came forth and they wanted more signs from him. And Jesus said, "Why does this generation seek after a sign? Verily I say unto you, there shall be no sign given unto this generation." And that was in verse 12, by the way. And they come and they want this sign. It's like, and I think if they really wanted that sign because they believed in Jesus and that sign would make them believe, I don't know that he wouldn't have given it to him. He might have done it. But I think they just wanted a sign because they wanted to test him, because they had no faith that he was really the Son of God. Jesus doesn't demand, he doesn't cave to our demands because of our lack of faith. Jesus responds when we show our faith, and when we show that we have our faith and we have that faith that he can do what we are asking him to do. He's not going to be held hostage by our demands, but when we have faith that he does have the power to do what we need him to do, we can see him work and we can see those miracles happen. And so after that, a blind man, speaking of miracles, receives his sight gradually, and that starts in verse 22. It's at this point in the story, with both the Pharisees and the disciples suffering from spiritual blindness, that Mark tells us of an unusual healing. Jesus cures a man of blindness, but only in 2 stages. The disciples, too, are about to receive their spiritual sight in 2 stages. Very soon, Simon Peter will acknowledge that Jesus is the Messiah, but the disciples will still fail to see that being Messiah involves suffering and death. They won't fully recognize Jesus until after his resurrection. So what happened there in that story is there was a blind man that came and he asked Jesus for help. And he says, "Can you, I need to be healed of my blindness." And so it says he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw. And he looked up and said, "I see men as trees walking." After that, he put his hands again upon his eyes and made him look up. And he was restored and saw every man clearly. So he didn't just heal him all at once, just snap his fingers or just touch his eyes and he completely could see. He did that in a 2-step process, which is a little bit of a different thing for Jesus. And so then in verse 27, the secret is kind of out. So it's Caesarea Philippi, a town in the far north. Jesus asked his disciples the key question: who do people think that he is? And more to the point, who do you think that he is? Most people think that Jesus is a great prophet, but Peter declares, "You are the Christ." It is the most momentous statement that he will ever make, because the Christ is God's anointed king, the Messiah for whom the Jews hope. But if Peter is expecting applause and instant promotion, he's disappointed. Jesus insists that they keep this secret to themselves. There will be a disaster if excited crowds try to make him king and end his mission with a bloodbath, because that is not the kind of king that Jesus came to be. And then starting in verse 31, Jesus changes the tone a little bit. Instead of planning his coronation, Jesus insists that he, the Son of Man, must suffer. He will be rejected by the very people who should welcome him. He will be killed, but after 3 days he will rise again. Peter thinks this is wrong. He isn't following Jesus just to see him die. He's looking forward to making him king. When he presses this point, Jesus turns on him. Peter is talking like Satan when he urges Jesus to seize an earthly empire. It's typical of Satan that he tries to subvert God's purposes. From now on, Jesus often talks about the suffering and death that lie ahead. He also makes it clear that his disciples are going to suffer too and make sacrifices. Now Jesus sets out on the journey which will take him to Jerusalem. And fittingly, tomorrow we celebrate Easter Sunday, which is after Jesus had been in Jerusalem, and that is where he is going to be crucified. And he's basically telling his disciples here in this reading that is coming, that is coming as he is the Messiah. So he and his disciples will be traveling from the far north back to Galilee and Capernaum. From there, they will go south from Judea and Transjordan, and eventually they'll come back to Jericho and go on from there to Jerusalem. This journey will eventually take Jesus to the cross. Jesus says that those who follow him must share his suffering. They will give up everything for the sake of Jesus and his gospel. They will be disgraced and condemned in the eyes of the world. It may look as though they are wasting their lives, but they will be rewarded with eternal life in the kingdom of God. And that's the promise that we have as followers of Christ, that even though it may look like we're wasting our life, like we could be doing more according to the world's eyes, like we could have more according to the world's eyes, we're not working for our earthly rewards. We are working for heavenly rewards and working for God's kingdom. And what he has to offer is, well, what the earth has is nothing compared to what God has to offer us in eternity. And so that's all for today from the book of Mark. I will see you back here tomorrow in the book of 1 Corinthians.